So my topic that I was given is how to manage your landscape for carbon. When I first got given the topic, I thought, well, this is a massive topic. It's basically my entire career is advising people who manage land on how to best do it for whatever their purpose in management is. So I've tried to really squeeze it into 20 minutes, which means I'm going to be quite general in a lot of techniques and strategies. And I guess I'm trying to infer some of the principles and theories behind what good landscape management looks like and why it's important for carbon farming. We might be on old technology. Not on yet.
No, this one is my mistake. I put in the wrong USB plug. Apologies. Thank you.
We're away. So, a couple of the main sort of questions I'm hoping I can provide some information for you guys on in this presentation are, first of all, defining what is your landscape. When I got, again, given the topic, I thought, well, people might have different ideas on what their landscape is. Secondly, what does a landscape that's well managed for carbon look like? How does it act? And thirdly, what are some of the management techniques and strategies that can get us to that landscape? So starting with what is your landscape? If you look in the dictionary, landscape is defined as the visible features of an area of land. It's fairly meaningless, I think. First question is, well, how big is a landscape? According to that definition, it's as far as you can see, but you can stand on a hill and see a lot further than if you're standing in the bottom of a creek. Is it a paddock? Is it a station? Is it a drainage catchment? It doesn't really give me much information. I think a much more appropriate way to deal with the question is to approach it from a landscape ecology perspective. So landscape ecology is defined as, I think quite neatly here, the interactions between spatial patterns and ecological processes across an area. So if we look at it that way, we can modify that landscape definition to include the word connected. So it's an area of features that are connected through ecological processes. And I guess that's kind of a key message from what I'm trying to say is these landscapes are dynamic things. They're constantly in motion and changing, and they're connected across various scales of spatial area. So when we're looking at managing landscapes, we're not just looking at managing a static thing, we're looking at how we can manage the connections and those ecological processes to deliver us the results we want with the minimal time and money interventions. So the more important question then becomes, how does the area I'm managing for carbon fit within the landscape? So what are the features that it is connected to? What are the areas and features that are influencing the area I'm managing, and what are the areas that it is influencing in turn? So we have here just an aerial image of a landscape. Again, landscapes can be various sizes, I believe, depending on what are the connections and ecological processes going on within the area. So within this landscape, at first it kind of looks a bit of a mess, but one of the things I think is really important is to understand the dynamics and the connections that are going on before you even start to worry about how to manage it. So what we can do is go into a landscape pattern. So this is where we start to look at how things are flowing through the landscape. What is actually connecting these various parts of the areas? So we start off, if we go back to look at the breakaway slope up the top there, which we can mark out, and then we can say, well, we've got water coming off those breakaway slopes as coalescing channels. They meet at an area known as the keyline slope, and then they start to fan out into these sort of wash zones of mulga and wandery vegetation. So within that landscape, we've actually got several connected parts of land that need to be managed not only holistically, but looked at individually and saying, well, what are the techniques and strategies that can help us in each of these parts? And it may be that we're only looking to manage one of those areas for carbon, but we still need to think about those remaining areas because they're quite often as important for managing the area we actually want to change. So what are some of the ecological processes that occur within a landscape? Well, I think the big three ones that we've already spoken about a lot here are the water and wind in the form of erosion and deposition, fauna in terms of grazing, physical trampling and predation, and fire in form of burning. Of course, there's many, many more. Landscapes are in infinitely complex things. These are the sort of macro processes that we can really influence and we can actually have control and change over to a certain extent, but that will also deliver quite widespread and meaningful changes to landscape condition. So these are the three that we're going to focus on today. So the next thing is then, well, what does a good carbon landscape look like? Well, we know from previous speakers that carbon in the landscape is predominantly stored in the soil and in the above and below ground vegetation biomass. Therefore, we would expect that a landscape with lots of carbon is a landscape that has lots of healthy soil and lots of healthy vegetation. It sounds an awful lot like the definition of a healthy landscape, and that kind of is. When we're managing for carbon, we're essentially just trying to improve the health of our landscape, which is the same as what we're trying to do when we're managing for pastoral management or when we're managing for conservation management. So a lot of the techniques and strategies we're going through here are things that you will already be very familiar with. You'll probably already be trialling in your areas. There's nothing particularly new or groundbreaking or different that you have to do to manage for carbon, which is a benefit because it means that there's nothing too scary or challenging or in contradiction to how you might manage your landscape otherwise. It is worth noting, though, that there is exceptions to this definition. Here's a photo of a very good, a landscape, an area of vegetation and soil. Is it a functioning ecosystem? Well, looking at it, you'd say yes, definitely. It looks healthy, it's full of vegetation. Is it a good carbon landscape? I'd say definitely is. Full of vegetation, woody biomass, the soil will be healthy and functioning, there'll be lots of soil carbon underneath. So I'd say this would be a very good carbon landscape. Is it a healthy landscape? I'd have to say definitely not, and that's because this is actually a mesquite infestation on Marty Station in the northwest of Australia. So there are exceptions to this. Sometimes you can have good carbon landscapes that are not necessarily what you'd call a healthy landscape. However, that's a question of ethics as to whether we manage for good carbon landscapes purely or whether we manage for good healthy carbon landscapes. I'd tend to think we'd like to manage for good healthy carbon landscapes rather than purely carbon landscapes. So going back to our ecological functioning of land systems, we need to look at land systems and land system health from a functional perspective, not just a static perspective, not what it looks like now, but how it's actually operating. This is a fairly succinct list of a few of the ecological processes that lead to a functioning rangelands ecosystem, and it starts at the very top with production of above ground and below ground biomass. So that is key to everything. That's where it all starts. From that, a whole chain of events occur. You have a production of litter, you have incorporation of that litter into the soil, this increase in organic matter and the stabilisation of soil beds, which leads to that from that increased organic matter. This leads to increased permeability of the soil and also increased water holding capacity. Then you have decreased compaction and bulk density, which leads on to decreased runoff, increased permeability and water intake, improved water budget and balance. Finally, leading on to increasing the turnover of those essential elements within the soil, and all that leads towards increased above ground phytomass and increased landscape functioning. You get greater water use efficiency, higher. You can read through them all there. There's a whole suite of positive benefits for a landscape that result from that very first step of the production of above and below ground deciduous dry matter. Finally, that leads to enhanced ecosystem functioning, increased productivity and production, which swings all the way back to the front, increases your production of above and below ground deciduous dry matter. So that's the sort of functioning ecosystem. I think we need to start looking right at the very top, that very first step of the production of above and below ground deciduous dry matter. And that's where I think we need to target our efforts, and that's where these three macro processes come in. So it's again working on the soil by using the erosion and deposition, managing erosion and deposition, increasing biomass within the landscape through managing grazing and other animal impacts, and through managing your burning regimes. So with those three processes, if we can get a good handle on those, we're going to have a pretty good chance of improving our above and below ground biomass, and therefore leading to all this chain of events that's going to bring us to hopefully a good, healthy, functioning ecosystem, which is also a good carbon land system. It's very important to remember that there needs to be management of all three of these things, that there is no silver bullet. We can't look at one thing and say that's all I need and then I'm set. Everything is interacting, everything's connected, everything's dynamic, so therefore the management of that landscape has to be holistic and looking at all possible outcomes, interactions and connections. With that in mind, I guess my main area of work is advising on landscape management with land managers in the rangelands. The process I use is the ESRM process, the Ecologically Sustainable Rangelands Management process. It's essentially a planning process for land managers. It increases the understanding of those ecological processes that are occurring in their landscape and provides on-ground management strategies to achieve a desired outcome for the landscape. The process is based heavily on science, but it's got a strong focus on practicality and land manager involvement, so we try and make it as much about the land manager driving the process and bringing their own knowledge and ideas to the plan, because at the end of the day they're the ones that are going to be implementing the plan, and they're the ones that have got to stand behind it and say that this is what I want to do. And they've also got to understand what is going into that plan. So it's as much about an education process as a planning process. To date, we've delivered over 65 of these plans across properties in Western Australia, and the demand is still strong, so it has been tried and tested in all different regions of the state, and most of the feedback I've had is good. It's certainly changed as I get feedback from different people, and we try to make it that little bit more valuable and meaningful for land managers, but it's a process that seems to work and deliver good outcomes. So within the ESRM process, there's a number of theories and principles we aim. This is obviously the goal of all ESRM plans, to have a bursting dam on your property. I guess the message with this is you've got to think about the consequences of what you do, and if you go in and build massive structures like that, you're going to end up with huge risks of things going wrong. So when you're managing water within a landscape, some of the rangelands rehydration techniques that we recommend will be discussed comprehensively by PJ, so I'll just go through them briefly. But the process and theory is essentially about trying to slow water down through your landscape, how to maximise what water falls onto your property so that it does the most good for you in terms of pasture growth and soil stability. We use various techniques: scrub packing, sieve structures, contour and ponding banks, and track buns. I'm just literally going to fly through some photos here of the sort of work that we've recommended and implemented through the ESRM plans. So in these photos you can see some sieve structures, some scrub packing and some contour banks that have been done through the state, sometimes on a large scale. So this is a property up in the Pilbara where they've actually gone out over an extremely large area and implemented contour banks. These were only put in this year, and the feedback I've had so far was that after the nice, steady, gentle winter rainfall that they received this year, they've responded really well. So hopefully we'll get some good up-to-date photos. On the contour, those ones, yep. This is an area in the Gascoyne that went through the process a little earlier. So this is about 15 or 20 years old, these banks, and you can see the response that we've been getting on a previously scalded flat, just by introducing some activity onto the flat in the right way, in a minimal way, and combined with some grazing management. So if we're looking from a carbon perspective, we've significantly increased the carbon potential of that area. This has been done, mechanical intervention, so some ripping and contour banks.
And then putting seeds in?
No, just natural seeding, that one. Yep. And you can start to see where you've got response within the banks, but you're also starting to get response between the banks. And that's a sign of the ecosystem actually starting to function again, that soil is starting to do its job, and you're starting to see that functioning coming back into the system where it's regenerating itself and requires far less input from anybody else. Again, some images of a scalded flat taken in 1978. This is up in the Kimberley. The manager introduced some banks in 2012, and 4 years later in 2016 he's seen a significant response across those banks. He's essentially recovered that entire area, and he's using these for cattle grazing, but if you were to be managing this area for carbon, I think you'd be pretty happy with that response from a fairly minimal intervention. So within the Esrim plan, we generally identify those areas that may be needing some work, looking at how things are connected, of course. We always have principles on where we start within a landscape, what we need to do within landscapes, but that's kind of the map we can draw up for each individual area, identifying techniques and strategies that might be useful to rehabilitate that area, some waypoints on where to do it, and then obviously some on-ground advice on how to go about implementing those on-ground activities. Of course, the most effective way to minimise erosion in any sort of landscape is to maximise the level of ground cover you have. That leads me to the next point, which is managing animals and how best to do it. Again, probably not like this. We've already talked quite a bit about grazing, so I'm going to really try and quickly get through this, but there's essentially no contradiction between how you manage landscapes for carbon and grazing. You've got your options of well, let's start at the top there. The majority of carbon, we've already said, is stored in woody material as shrubs and trees. Now, generally, cattle and sheep don't like to eat wood, so you're fairly safe on grazing within woody vegetation. However, you do need to think about that ecological functioning again. So you don't want an unhealthy system. You're not necessarily going to lose a lot of your woody vegetation, but you still want the system to be functioning. Soil carbon, on the other hand, requires really healthy soil functioning, and that requires a lot more biomass across the area and a lot more ground cover. So if you're looking to work in the soil carbon field, grazing management becomes a lot more important. So there's two potential strategies I see. There's either total exclusion of grazing, or there's strategic grazing with a rest-based grazing system. If you are managing grazing within the same area, or if you are planning on grazing an area that you're also managing for carbon, some of the general points are, as we've already said, a short, infrequent, heavy graze, removing all non-domestic grazing as much as possible through various techniques there. The three benefits of grazing within a carbon farming area are that if managing appropriately, it can enhance the landscape function. It is a useful tool to reduce fire loads, and it can provide a significant supplementary income from an area. But there's a major risk, and that is that if it's managed inappropriately, you can quickly degrade what current carbon stores you have and any future sequestration rates through the reduced landscape function. And a couple of photos there Sam's already brought up about the improved perennial grass root systems based on that rest-based grazing system. So again, within Esrim, we look at your grazing management, we look at it as a holistic plan, and we identify areas that you might be able to use for different grazing strategies, be they conservation and culture, carbon, rotational grazing. We look at carrying capacities, stocking rates, and grazing systems. So it's kind of, again, tying it all in. We've identified areas for erosion control. We're looking at station-wide grazing management and the different strategies that can be employed within those different areas. Finally, fire. Very quickly, carbon farming requires minimal fire. Generally in mulga shrubland, we say fire should be excluded until such time as the fuel load within the area makes wildfire a major risk. Of course, grazing might minimise that, at which time a cool winter burn may be effective to refresh vegetation. In a eucalypt woodland, I'm using these two examples because they're generally where carbon is stored in vegetation, in that woody shrubland and woodland. So again, spinifex underneath, we recommend a cool winter burn every 5 to 7 years in a 10,000 hectare mosaic. Tussock grassland fire should really be excluded and managed similar way to mulga. I believe grazing should be used in tussock grassland because it's making more use of the pasture than if it just goes up in smoke. But if you're not grazing it, then similar way, let it get to the point where it's becoming a real wildfire risk and then maybe burn it off a bit. But you've got to have control over your area before you can even start to implement any of these strategies. And again, that comes through to the broader landscape management question of how things work in between. So you might look at getting a mosaic burning pattern, putting some fire sacrifice areas around your carbon farming area, or implementing some fire breaks. And again, within Esrim, we go through all of that with you, and we identify some, in this case, a mosaic burning pattern that could be implemented on a station, where we identify particular fire management zones, put in a rotation, and map it out according to your landscape. So I'll leave it there, and I've probably rushed.